Hello. So in this episode of Writing Notes, we're going to talk about peer reviewing. Now, peer reviewing is one of the most crucial aspects of writing. It's a thing that we do right the way through the writing process. So we do it in almost every composition classroom, in every university, in at least the US, and in many other countries. Peer review is a crucial part of that process. We do that all the way up through professional work. I'm a publishing scholar. I've published a decent number of scholarly articles. I have my book under contract. All of these things get peer reviewed. So I, for instance, just recently got back peer review feedback from an article I sent for a special edition of Neo-Victorian Studies, the journal Neo-Victorian Studies. I had two people the editors got two people to review that essay, and they sent me suggestions. So this is something that we do, again, throughout the writing process. At whatever level of the writing process you're at, peer review is going to be part of it. So, to take a step back, what is peer review? Well, peer review is when you have another scholar, another writer, another classmate, whatever it is, look at your writing, look at something you're working on, and give you feedback. That's fundamentally it. So why is this so useful? Well, one thing is that even if the person that you are getting feedback from is not an expert in that field, they are a reader. They are a viewer if you're doing, say, a video project or something like this. They're a listener if you're doing a podcast or something like that. So they will bring a different perspective than you have to that thing. I'm going to talk about essays because I teach composition. So if you're having someone peer review your essay, let's say you're a first-year university student in a class full of first-year university students, and you're having someone from that class peer review your essay. They aren't an expert in rhetoric, probably. So you might say to yourself, well, Becky who sits next to me doesn't know anything more about rhetoric than I do. Why should I trust what she says? Well, the reason, and studies have found this consistently, the reason you should trust what Becky, who sits next to you, thinks is because Becky is a reader. She's come to this essay that you're working on, and she's able to say, yeah, that makes sense to me. That argument follows. I see where you're going with this. All of this works. Or, here's what doesn't make sense to me. I'm not convinced by this argument. I don't see any real evidence. You haven't presented any real evidence for this claim, whatever it is. So, while Becky may not know the rhetorical terminology, she knows what makes sense and what doesn't. And she can bring that perspective to you. Now, some people are naturally more adept at peer reviewing than others. That's totally fair. What you want to make sure that you're doing as you're reviewing for someone else is you want to make sure that you are thinking about their paper critically. So there's a desire that a lot of us have when we peer review to be supportive. Especially if you don't necessarily know the person that well, we don't want to come across as mean people, and that's very fair. But if something isn't working in an essay, if an essay isn't persuasive, if it's not convincing for whatever reason, and you tell your classmate, yeah, I think that's good, and then they get a D on that paper, you haven't done them a favor. So what you want to try and do as you're peer reviewing is to try and think about what do I know about this author? What do I know about the person who's going to be grading this paper? What do I know about rhetoric? What do I know about the expectations? If there's an assignment sheet, if there's grading standards, grading criteria, something like this, go back to those and check that this essay is actually completing that assignment, that it's meeting those requirements. Because again, this is the thing that this is the friendliest thing you can do, is not just to say, this is great, I love it, but to say, here's how you can move this paper closer to getting an A. So that's one thing that you do want to be thinking about. Now, in terms of the approach to peer review, there are as many ways to peer review as there are people who do peer review, which is to say that everyone is going to have their own distinct approach based on what they know about writing, based on their background, based on what they've been taught, based on what they think the assignment requires, based on whatever it is. Everybody has their own approach, and there's nothing wrong with this inherently, because again, if we can bring multiple perspectives, if we can get multiple sets of feedback, multiple types of ideas, then the writer can choose the things that are going to work best. So, that being said, when you're approaching peer review, there's a couple of major things you want to be thinking about. The first thing that you want to be thinking about is, what works in this essay? What has this author done that's successful? And then, more importantly, perhaps, why is it successful? So, do they have a strong thesis statement? And if so, what makes it a strong thesis statement? Do they have well-organized paragraphs? And if so, what makes those paragraphs work so well? The reason you want to identify those, and the reason you want to explain why this strength works, is because then your partner can take that information and duplicate that, either in the parts of this essay that aren't as strong or in future essays. So if your partner has got a particularly good, say, thesis technique, if they've done a good job with a thesis, that's something that they could replicate in a future paper if they know that it was a good thesis and why, what made it so strong. Now the same thing works the other direction. You want to be thinking about what doesn't work in this essay. And a lot of people find this much harder, especially first-year students are often going to find it much harder to say, here's what I don't think is working. But that's a crucial phase, because again, if it's a problem, it's better for you as a peer reviewer to point it out so that the author can fix it before it gets turned in for that grade. So again, you want to be thinking about what doesn't work, and then maybe more importantly, how could the author fix it? So if the paragraph structure isn't there, if they don't have, say, a topic sentence, or they don't have a claim in their paragraph, if it's just information, just evidence not supporting anything, that's something that you could tell them. You'd say, this paragraph isn't working because it needs a claim, and then it needs interpretation to tie the evidence to that claim. So if you can make that kind of suggestion and they can fix that paragraph, you'll have done them a favor when it comes to getting their paper graded. So the last thing I want to talk about with peer review very quickly is the question of editing. So a lot of people, when they peer review, will make grammar and mechanics changes or suggestions. I have a mixed opinion of this. On the one hand, if you're making correct grammar and mechanics suggestions, it's not inherently a bad thing. The potential problem with doing grammar and mechanics work in peer review is that if the essay needs a lot of substantial work, so say if the structure of the paper is just fundamentally nonsensical, if paragraphs need to be rewritten, if there are big changes, whatever it is, doing that grammar and mechanics work can have two negative outcomes. One is that you're doing work that if your partner is then going to say delete that paragraph and rewrite it, the grammar and mechanics work that you've done in making those corrections is now gone. That text is no longer there. The other negative consequence, and this is in some ways the more serious one, is that if there are major things that need to be fixed, but you've identified a bunch of small-scale things that are easy to fix, sometimes your partner will just fix those small-scale things and ignore the larger-scale problems. So that's not doing your partner a favor. If they're going to get a D on that paper because it's nonsense, grammatically correct nonsense may just get them a D+, whereas if you'd said, look, here's how you fix the nonsense that this paper is, that might have gotten them a C or a B, maybe even an A. So again, you want to be thinking about how can I give the most useful feedback to my partner? How can I help them strengthen their essay as much as possible?